you, Dr. Peck, but I know there are a lot of things that we want to cover, and we just have to be able to give all of our speakers a little bit of time. And our next speaker is Dr. Cheryl Kitt. Her title is Overview of the NIH Peer Review Process. And I asked her if KIT was short for something, and she said, no, it's actually long for KIT, K-I-T. So, Cheryl Kitt.
Just to explain, my parents came to this country through Ellis Island, and my son was doing research for a project and found the manifest, and our name was actually K-I-T when my father first came to this country. And so the other interesting tidbit is that I'm a twin, and my sister and I have been in research studies since we were 5 years old through the Minnesota study of twins, and I think that's how I got interested in research myself. My sister is an elementary school teacher, actually, so that's a little bit of information about me. How many of you have actually applied for grants lately? Yay, I want to ask you how you did. But since you're here, I assume you were successful. And so let me tell you a little bit about the Center for Scientific Review and the review process, and particularly for those of you at different stages of your career. So in purple is the Center for Scientific Review. The NIH is actually a collection of 27 institutes and centers, and the Center for Scientific Review is actually the gateway for all grant applications. They're then moved to institutes based on what you request in terms of who would like to fund your research. And I'll go through that rather quickly. I'm a New Yorker, so I can talk really fast. Okay, so as Willow already told you, there are a couple of mechanical things that you really do have to do before you even submit an application to NIH, and that's register in the Commons. And if you haven't done so, please do so today. It takes about 2 days to become registered. You can't submit anything to grants.gov without registering in the Commons. And your sponsored projects offices can take you through there, or anyone in this room who's funded by NIH knows what the routine is. If you do, sorry, let me go back for 1 second. And if you don't already subscribe to the NIH Guide to Grants and Contracts, please do that today too. It's the place where NIH announces all funding opportunities. You have to list a funding opportunity on every grant application, whether there's money associated with it or not. We also have announcements, requests for information, when we ask you things that we're interested in and what you think about. We also post notices, which are usually policy changes. So you really do need to take a look at these. And if you're in the fund-seeking mode, you should look there every day, because there are things posted there every day. Although money is not as abundant as it was maybe 10 years ago, there are still funding opportunities there. The process, as Willow described, is that you have an idea, and that's actually us in the federal government supporting you, putting our hand on your shoulder. Please submit your best ideas to us. The ideas are submitted electronically for the most part, except for some of the larger grant applications like centers and program projects, although program projects have now become electronic. But centers are still received on paper. They go directly to the Center for Scientific Review once they go through validations in grants.gov. And I'll take you very quickly through the process here. Once your application comes into NIH, if you don't tell us where your application should be reviewed, what study section, or what institute you'd like to fund it, you're going to trust us to do it. We're the government, please trust us. So after the review, your summary statements, the critiques go to the institutes, and it's the institutes and their national advisory councils that make recommendations for funding. The Center for Scientific Review has no money. Don't ask us for any. We don't fund anything. We just do an unbiased scientific review of your applications. That's actually our beautiful building in Bethesda. By the way, please enjoy glorious Washington this week. The cherry blossoms have already bloomed. So we receive all the applications. We refer them, as I said, to the institutes and review groups. They're reviewed for scientific merits. Now, the institutes can also do scientific reviews, mainly for training, the Ks and the Ts, and some of the fellowships, and program projects and centers, but CSR will do them as well if asked. The Center for Scientific Review is divided into 5 scientific divisions. If you go to our website at csr.nih.gov, if you click on any of the boxes below these units, you'll find the descriptions of the study sections, and you really ought to look there to find the right ones that should be reviewing your applications. You can certainly tell us what study sections should be reviewing them and what expertise you need, but you should never tell us who you want to review your application, because I can assure you you'll never get them. But you should tell us who is in conflict with you. We hope not to discover those during the review, but sometimes that happens. It happens more often than we like. In fact, it's one of the biggest nightmares of the scientific review officer. They get to the study section and a reviewer says, and I've seen this myself, this is a former student of mine. They should have told us that before, and what we will likely do is defer that application to be reviewed at another time. So, to help your application get to the right study section, please submit a cover letter. It doesn't count towards page limits, and frankly, only about half of you do it. I don't know why all of you don't do it, because we honor them almost always, because you know best where your science should be reviewed. Unfortunately, you usually tell us after the review, and it's too late. So please tell us before, and we're happy to discuss that with you. Please contact your scientific review officer. They're one of your best friends. Your program officer is your second best friend. And if you can't name them today, you're doing yourself a disservice. Joan is probably a program director for most of you in this room. And she knows all of you. You better get to know her. And she's happy to return your information. And she could walk you through this as well. Again, please use this as a take-home message. If you don't do it, or you know colleagues who aren't doing it, please remind them that they can and should be doing this. Your career stage is critical during the peer review. NIH, about a year ago or so, redefined an early stage investigator as someone who is no more than 10 years out from their terminal degree. For PhDs, for clinicians, it's a little bit different. It's from your last training or residency. And if there's any question about it, please talk to the program directors. And if you're denied this status, there's always an appeal process that we can talk to you about. There are mitigating circumstances. If you take time out for family reasons, we can extend that time as well. And the reason it's important is that it is still true that the funding institutes have different pay lines, better, almost twice as good, for the early stage career investigators, for the R01 applications. And so I would highly recommend all of your junior faculty, and those of you who are considering submitting applications now for R01s, that you designate yourself as an early career investigator in the Commons if you're eligible. NIH does do a validation, and if you're valid, then your application will get a little star next to it during review, and we'll review all of those applications together so that you're not competing against established investigators. There's leniency on numbers of publications and in preliminary studies as an early stage investigator. So it's very important that you do that. And just a little bit about study sections. The study sections, we always have the goal of having fewer people in the room. The more people in the room, the more likely that people are not paying attention to the discussion. The reason we have a lot of members on study sections is because we get a lot of applications. As an individual study section can review between 60 and 100 applications, and we have to assign 3 reviewers per application. So it's just simple math. If there are a lot of applications, there are going to be a lot of reviewers in the room. And if asked, please say yes to serve. We really do need you. So what do the reviewers look for? It's all about impact now. The final priority score is an impact score, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. As you think about your application, please make it exciting, make it clear. Please have other people read it before you submit it. I think most academic institutions these days have either formal or informal committees that will read your application and give you brutally honest feedback. You could always ask your sponsored projects offices who currently reviews for NIH, or I'd be happy to tell you who at your institution is reviewing for us, because they know what good applications look like and they know what fatal flaws look like too, and you should be asking them. You should also ask your senior faculty to look at their applications and their critiques. I hope they'll give them to you, especially for the successful ones. Sometimes it's a little embarrassing to look at the poor reviews, but you get tremendous insight about what the reviewers are looking for. So use your own homegrown expertise before you even submit an application. Proofreading an application, rather, spell checking doesn't always catch the comments that you are looking for. It will pick up correctly spelled words, but they're the wrong context. So please have somebody else, another human being, read your application, and don't rely on electronic proofreading. Again, the overall impact score, that's the score that's going to determine funding. 10 is the best, and a 90 is the worst. I frankly have never seen a 90. Hope I never do. Nevertheless, the overall impact, if your application is discussed, now as I said, each study section gets about 100 applications and only about half of them are discussed in the meeting. The 3 assigned reviewers assign initial scores, initial priority scores to them, and we rank order the best to the worst, and we sort of cut off at around half, and those are not discussed, although reviewers can bring up any applications they wish if they want to discuss them. The applications are now also given scores on the 5 core criteria which you write about in applications, including significance, in the investigator you need to talk about yourself, innovation, approach, and environment. Each are then scored from 1 to 9. This just repeats what I said, and the slides will be available. It's all about impact. Please write about it every way you can in your application, not just in the introduction. You can always write about it in the specific aims, and make sure you're telling the beginning, the middle, and end of your story, that the reviewer is left with understanding what impact will mean. The reviewers essentially look at a score sheet like this, although there is no binning of applications, just some verbal descriptors about what an outstanding or exceptional application might look like. Exceptional with essentially no weaknesses. I've never seen the perfect application myself, but although maybe some of you have them, I haven't seen them. So this is what reviewers are looking at. For fellowship reviews, there are a little bit different requirements for overall impact. Will the fellowship enhance the candidate's potential for and commitment to a productive, independent scientific career? So as a fellowship writer, an application writer, answer that question. My research will enhance my potential. Or your mentor also has to address this issue. And in purple are the other requirements for fellowships. For career awards, it's a little bit different. Again, the reviewers have to assess the likelihood of the candidate to maintain a strong research program. That's what the reviewers are looking for. As an applicant, you need to write it in that way. You can, I hate to say this, fill in the blank. Let the reviewers know why you will have a strong research program. For our career awards and fellowships, letters of reference are required. For career awards and R01s and other mechanisms, they're not necessarily required, but there's no restriction on them. And I highly recommend, particularly for early career investigators, submit letters of support. It doesn't hurt. It actually, sometimes reviewers are looking for it. They want to see where you've been and what your academic institution and collaborators will say about you. It helps. I'm going to go through this quickly about investigators, and this is all again posted on the csr.nih.gov website, what reviewers are looking for and how to write these sections of the application about your personal statement. And for junior investigators, this is critical. Please take it seriously and have other people look at it. Why your experience and qualifications make you uniquely qualified to do this research. Innovation, again, the methodology doesn't have to be the innovative thing, but something about you or something about your environment or something about the question, the concepts has to be innovative. You can use these bullets and basically write your application around that. by saying, at least in bullet number 1, my research seeks to challenge and fill in the blank. If you tell the reviewer that, please don't wait for the reviewer to tell you that. If you wait for the reviewer to answer these questions, you're in trouble. And again, for the approach, this is where you're going to lay out exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. If there are standard approaches, because the page limits are very rigid now, you can just have citations for standard approaches. If you're developing a new approach, then you should write about it succinctly. And the environment here too, having a statement, a letter from your academic institution, department chair, you name it, is a good thing. Other issues that reviewers absolutely consider and will affect final scoring are protection and inclusion of human subjects, children, and minorities. You really do have to do this. For the most part, clinical applications fall down on this because it's not taken as seriously as other parts of the application. But I'm going to say that if you don't do it, it will seriously affect your score. You will then get a critique. Please read it and don't call your program director right away. Okay, promise. They work for you. And I can just give you some advice. Only call them once a week instead of once a day. I've had that experience. I've been a program director where someone hounded me every day until I told him to please stop. And he said that he's a taxpayer and has the right to do that. And I told him I'm a taxpayer too. And I wouldn't want him calling. I wouldn't call him every day. And in any event, you should read it and think about it before making that call. And so there, you need to talk to your program director, and I try to always find a picture of someone who's actually here. Joan, who has a very close relationship with all of you and the community. The program director really is your point of contact. After the review, they're going to sort of read between the lines. They will likely at the review of your application or on the phone. So they have a little bit more insight. They're not going to tell you who reviewed it, but they really do have a unique perspective on where you stand. They're probably not going to tell you, unless you're close to the pay line, whether you're going to get funded or not. It's really too early in the game. But you can continue to have that communication with your program director. And if the program director happens to call you, that's a good thing. They want more information, and it's likely that there's a possibility of funding out of the usual pay line. So please answer the call. And so we have a lot of information. We have 2 brand new videos that are really worth watching. And if you, like me, I see a lot of you do have iPhones, you can watch it on YouTube. These are on YouTube. You can watch them, and my children watch them too. Because they showed me how to use YouTube. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kidd. I didn't get to talk to our next speaker beforehand, so I hope I don't embarrass him. Our next speaker is Wally Schaefer, and the title of his talk is Sex, Ethnicity, and the NIH Research Awards. His title is Senior Scientific Advisor for Extramural Research. And Wally, you have to tell us if you were born Wally, Walter, Walton. Tell us about the Wally.
I am embarrassed. Yeah, my mom called me Walter after a brand company. And it was shortened to Wally. She liked Wally for some reason. I don't know. And I have a dog sitter that calls me Wale after the rapper Wale. What can I say? It would take me a long time to run out of rap. Cheryl and Willow's presentations are really important and a good jumping off point for what I'm going to talk about. It turns out that we've recently done a study, and I think it's going to appear in Sally Rocky's blog in a few weeks, and we looked at institutions that submitted at least 50 applications in a year, and then sorted those institutions by their rank in terms of NIH funding, and looking at the top 100 or even the top 50 institutions in this country that submitted at least 50 applications a year. You see some institutions that have success rates at about 40%, and others that have success rates at about 10%, and the average, of course, is around 20%. Now, personally, I'd rather work at one of those institutions with a 40% success rate, and one wonders what the heck those institutions are doing. And, you know, I've called a few of them to see what's going on at those institutions, and many of them have procedures in place for all of their grant applicants that they have to be submitted a month in advance to the chair of the department, and then the chair of the department sends them to other faculty members. They get reviewed very comprehensively by people that sit on Cheryl's study sections, and so they get that feedback immediately. They can spiff up their applications, and then they go to an editor, and then all of the, you know, they're proofread and sent in, and you know, Cheryl talked about the absence of bias at CSR, and well, we're all biased in different ways, you know, and I think there probably is a Matthew effect that operates in those kinds of environments. If you're from an institution that has a good track record, it probably means a lot to those reviewers. So anyhow, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but it's just well, it's a bonus. Okay, so what I am going to talk about is workforce diversity and why it's important to the NIH. And the NIH has been concerned about workforce diversity for 40 years. The Minority Access to Research Career, the Minority Biomedical Research Support Program, and the research centers in minority institutions were set up more than 40 years ago. And part of this is related to the statements that you see there that now appear in every diversity-related announcement, and maybe eventually in every announcement that the NIH makes. That the NIH has a unique and compelling need to promote diversity for the reasons that are indicated there. And, you know, in terms of balancing and broadening the perspectives and setting research priorities, we've done some concept mapping and grant applications that were actually funded, and we find out that different races work on different problems that tend to be related to their own interests. Women are more likely to work in women's health issues, pediatric issues, those kinds of things. People, you know, in order to make sure that you're covering all the needs of the nation, you really have to have a diverse workforce, and I think more and more people at the NIH are convinced that this is the case. So what I wanted to talk about is how we're doing. So you probably have all seen this kind of stuff. If you look at our research training programs now, they're about half women, or even a higher proportion of the total slots for women now. And they're not shown on the slides, but NIH Career Awards are shown in this green here. And then the types of grants that we're all interested in here, the research project grants, which includes RO funds that have been mentioned several times, are pretty close to 30% women. And this is a fairly strong positive slope here. And, you know, so things are improving. The success rate for women on new grant applications, type 1s, is almost identical to what it is for men. On type 2 applications, women score a little bit lower than men do for reasons that are not clear. That doesn't mean that women are dropping out. If you look at the persistence within the pool of all funded research grants and look at age-related dropout rates, it's almost exactly the same as it is for men. So things are going reasonably well for women, but if you start looking at racial and ethnic minorities, you can see that things are not so good. And we started doing a bunch of studies related to that. Thank you. So it's worth noting here that about 12.5% of the total population identify themselves as Hispanic, and about 10.2% of the population identify themselves as Black or African American. But by the time you get to medical school faculty, both of those numbers are way down. And then when we look at those funded on research project grants at the NIH, things are not so good. So about 1% of the principal investigators on our research project grants, even after working on this for 40 years, you know, it's a problem. And I think we all recognize it as a problem. And so back in 2004, Peter Kington, who used to be the deputy director for NIH, and I engaged in some discussions that led to the studies that I'm going to talk about here. Then looking at the changes, so this is the Asian, the proportion of our research grants that go to Asian PIs, and you can see a pretty positive slope there. Hispanics here, for African Americans, it's pretty flat, and it has been for a long period of time. So we launched a series of studies based on these discussions. Money was identified for these studies. Most of them were done under contract. And the first one I'm going to talk about is by Jennifer Polhouse, who works for a company called Ripple Effects. And she found that the success rates for men and women were about the same over, you know, at least the primary research programs that we have. And so there were a lot of extensive studies. And then when we looked at the situation for racial and ethnic minorities, you have two really severe problems. One is the pipeline sucks. And the other thing is that there are big differences in review disparities across groups too. So this slide appeared in a paper that's currently on the Social Sciences Research Network. And it shows that there's an enrichment of whites moving from high school to college of about 6 to 7%. But you see a decrease in the proportion of blacks. So they're about 10.5% of the overall population in high school. And then you lose about half of them going from high school to college. And then when you go from college to graduate school, you lose another 3 or so percent. Whites are again enriched. Interestingly though, blacks and Hispanics are enriched going from college to medical school compared to whites. And so, you know, the whites drop out, you know, in that direction. And there's a huge enrichment in the number of Asians in those populations. And then when you go from graduate school to an assistant professorship, you can see that there's an enrichment for African Americans and Asians. And when you go from medical school to faculty positions, you can see an enrichment for whites and decreases for these other groups. And the other thing, which is really disheartening, is the differences in word probability across these racial categories. And so the success rates for whites is about 30%, 29 and change, and it's about 16% or 13 percentage points lower for African Americans. And we did some fairly comprehensive regression analysis to see if we could identify factors that were associated with this difference. And we could only account for about 10% of this differential using something like 80 different covariates. So, and these differences in success rates are persistent and pervasive. In other words, this looks at those applications that were in basic science. If you look at clinical translational science or behavioral and social science, you see exactly the same sort of pattern. And institutional characteristics don't seem to matter much. At the top 30, everybody's success rate goes up, but there's still this disparity between the different racial categories. So it's bad, it's not good. It's not good. And we're trying to figure out why, thank you, Karen, why this occurs. And so there are a number of things that are going on right now. So Donna Ginther, who is a professor of economics at the University of Kansas, is the primary author on many of these studies. And she has just completed a manuscript called MD's Medical Schools and NIH are a Wonder Works, and finds out that the delta, the differences between the racial categories and is not as big as it is for MDs as it is for PhDs. And also, all applicants that work in a medical school environment do better than those that submit applications from arts and sciences. I don't really know why, but that's what it's about. There are also some extended studies that we're about to watch that will look at other factors that may correlate with this differential outcomes. In other words, these are things that didn't appear in the structured data that was available in NSF databases, NIH databases, and AAMC databases. In other words, what is the postdoc training like? You know, what was the prestige of the mentor? How big are the individuals' networks? How well are they connected to the reviewers on those review committees? Are those differences that can explain these things? Are they factors that we can maybe focus on to remove some of those disparities? And finally, there's a really exciting activities from this diversity work group that has been appointed by the Directors Advisory Committee. So recommendations from this group will be going back to Dr. Collins and also his advisory committee. And that committee is chaired by Larry Tabak, who's the current Deputy Director for NIH, Reed Tuckson, and John Ruffin. And what they're looking at is experimental techniques to assess the benefit of pre-application mentoring, the type that Will and Cheryl were talking about, how to do that. You know, it's that kind of stuff that some of those highly ranked institutions probably and apparently do pretty well. And also use experimental techniques to determine if there is any kind of bias in peer review. Now, this is an issue that, you know, the possibility of this is something that none of us want to think about. That there might be racial bias in this setting. But there are a whole bunch of factors that correlate well with race, and it may not have anything to do with race, but, you know, anyhow, we're going to look at those kinds of things and see if they're operative from that as well. So I'm going to stop there, and, you know, if there are questions, I guess we're going to have a
Thank you, Wally. So if I could ask the speakers to come up front. And I'm going to just apologize early because I may need to leave. It depends on how long we go because I have to catch a flight. So I'm going to ask Dr. Nagel to come down so she can relieve me if I need to. I also want to take this opportunity before we start our question and answer session to acknowledge the ORWH team that worked on this workshop, pre-conference workshop. Dr. Joan Nagel led those efforts and really was tireless in making sure that this came off. Dr. Karen Witkin was her able assistant and energy behind the activity, and Joyce Rudick, is Joyce still here? She just stepped out. Okay, Joyce was the institutional memory and just pushing to get everything done. It's if you gotta get it done, you gotta get it done. So the three of those ladies and probably other ORWH staff, which I'm not aware of, were helpful. So I want to acknowledge them and my colleagues from the Women's Health Congress, Dr. Boystein and Dr. Klein. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions or comments. Doesn't have to be questions related to just the presentations, but the NIH process, where we welcome those comments as well. Please.
Hello, I'm Wendy Katzman from the University of California, San Francisco, and I'm lucky enough to have been a Birch Scholar for the last several years. And I'm now in the R1 application process, and I'm curious about the diversity awards that are currently being offered by NIAMS and NIA, and whether they are open to women, whether women are considered to be part of that, or is it really just ethnic minorities?
Which awards are you talking about?
There's some new diversity awards.
Are they diversity supplements or?
Yes, diversity supplement awards, correct.
So, if you're talking about diversity supplements, I think there are three groups that are eligible for those kinds of awards. But you have to work with a principal investigator in order to get a support under one of those diversity supplements. Racial and ethnic minorities, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and people with disabilities. So they fall in those categories or have somebody that falls in one of those categories, you're eligible. You should know that there is a reentry supplement too, and I think that Janine is a much better source of information about that than I am.
Well, we actually just reissued the reentry supplement. Thank you, Wally, and ORWH has and others with our IC colleagues. I think for the first time we had every single IC committed to supporting reentry awards, and that's for people that have left research, and we extended that to the postdoc level. Karen Witkin and Joan also worked on that. So that's different than what you were asking. So
Well,
I think
what about for re-entry? Is that something, re-entry into research
Yes.
after years of clinical practice?
yes, that's exactly what the reentry award is about. So you can get that information on our website, or we can send it to you. If you give your name to Dr. Witkin right there, we can get that information to you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Any other comments or questions for our NIH speakers? One over here. I'll repeat it since you're kind of far from the microphone, if I can hear you.
Well, it's a simple question. You did mention there is an advantage in different pay lines for early and new investigators for R01. What about R21? Do we get any advantage to that?
So the question relates to early stage investigators and new investigators for R21s to Dr. Kitt.
My advice, and I will boldly say this, if you're a junior investigator and eligible, do not apply for an R21. There is no advantage. You're competing with everyone else who may have much more experience, track record than you. Even though the R21 doesn't require preliminary data, the reviewers are looking at track record, and there is no funding advantage. In fact, they also compete with R01s in the funding by institutes. So, I think I made my message clear. If you are eligible, apply for an R01.
Other thoughts and questions?
What about the concept of a multi-PI? Is that looked down upon, or?
So if you're
Can you repeat the
eligible,
question?
yeah,
Sure.
the question was about multi-PI applications. So if you're eligible under the early career program, in order to take advantage of it, every one of your PIs also has to be in the same eligibility status. If you're on Senior Investigators Multi-PI Award and it's funded, you lose your eligibility.
Correct. But having lost that eligibility, is that a good thing then to be a multi-PI? I've heard both ways.
Sure, if you've already lost your eligibility, it's certainly something to consider. At some point, you might consider your own independent award. If you have a secure academic position, then you're okay. Often clinicians do participate in multi-collaborative projects, and that's a good thing because you can spread your support over a variety of projects. If you're an expert in whatever it is, many research groups want to have you on their projects, center grants or programs. That's okay, except, are there any deans in the room? When you come up for tenure, they're looking for independence, and being a member of a team is not always looked at in a positive way. So if there's some way for you to start developing your own research program, that would really benefit your success for tenure.
I'm going to take slight issue with what Cheryl said. I agree with the R21, that's probably not necessary for an early stage investigator, but we have another developmental grant mechanism that we use a lot at NIMH, the R34, and it's a developmental mechanism. If you want to study a population and you think at the end of the 3 years you would have some idea of what an intervention with this group might be, it's a very good thing because it gives you a chance to develop data, to develop an outline and the beginning of an intervention, and it sets you up very well to then come in and apply for a credible R01. You don't technically, we don't as an institute get kudos for funding R34s for an early stage investigator. That only accrues to the R01. But I think it's a very good mechanism to give you a little more seasoning so that you can write a really good R01.
Dr. Wicken, you had your hand up a few minutes ago.
Yes, because women's health is by nature interdisciplinary, I was hoping that perhaps you could give a little bit of advice about writing an interdisciplinary grant application and if anything is different, and if there's anything different in the review process for interdisciplinary grants.
Is this the one you're in the sandbox together?
So the question is related to interdisciplinary research applications and approaches. Willow, Wally, and
I can answer the review. I'll do
the
the
review.
part.
Okay.
So for interdisciplinary applications, we generally review those in special emphasis panels. They're panels of study section members that we put together to really focus on the components of that application and similar ones. They often don't fit into the standing committees, and so we do bring in expertise to review them. Many of you have reviewed for us as well. As far as assembling the application, those are the team, those are the sandbox kinds of things. Everybody's role has to be identified, but if you're a junior investigator, you really have to take the leadership role in this and explain very clearly what everyone else's role is. Again, you can have co-investigators and still gain the early stage investigator advantage. It's when it becomes a multi-PI application, that's when the rules change.
You know, I'm in AIDS, so from the very beginning, we've had really interdisciplinary research where we have immunologists, infectious disease docs, behavioral scientists, measurement people, ethnographers, all on the same grant, working to develop the same study. And we've been very fortunate that our review groups are also prepared to review this kind of diversity.
Well, since I'm at the podium, I'll take the liberty of asking a question. This one is especially for Dr. Schaefer. What is it about the medical school environment that's causing underrepresented minorities to thrive? I don't know, do you have some sense of that from the paper that you submitted?
I think it raises
Versus
all,
other
it raises all votes, for everybody. The success rates for medical schools is a little better than it is for arts and sciences campuses. And it's better for MDs, and I don't know, there may be some selection effects. It's harder to get into medical school than it is to many graduate programs. There could be all kinds of factors operating in those settings. I think part of it could have to do with the fact that NIH is interested in health-related science, and maybe you see more health-related science coming out of medical schools too.
Thank you.
One of the things that becomes more obvious in medical schools is that the individuals get more mentoring. There's more one-on-one care and hand-holding, and very few people drop out. I was at Hopkins for many years, and there's tremendous care and grooming of people in medical schools, and it's not like graduate schools. It's just not the same. There's much more of an investment in the individual.
When Cheryl started talking about the review, it made me think of something I had wanted to say, and that is, I think it's very important to have your application read by other people, especially somebody who's outside of your discipline. But try and keep it in the department or in your university. We've had really eager beaver new investigators send their application all over the country trying to get as much technical advice as they could. And every time they ask somebody, that means that that's a credible person who would now be in conflict and can't review your application. So leave some qualified people out there.
Good point. You can assume that anyone from your university is going to be recused from the review of your application anyway, so please ask them to take a look at it.
Dr. Regensteiner?
Quick question. Very disturbing what the data you showed, Dr. Schaefer. So are people looking, though, that, I just can't believe there would be deliberate bias, but still the factors that encourage the pipeline, the younger age, I think we have to really dig in to figure out what these factors are.
Yeah, the pipeline is a serious issue, and I think there will be recommendations from this ACE committee that I mentioned going back to Dr. Collins, and it wouldn't surprise me if there are some interventions that are discussed sometime this summer.
I would say for those of you who are still thinking about it, I'm hoping you are, please write to Wally. NIH is very open to your suggestions. Or you can send them to me. Because clearly at review we're very concerned about this. We're not quite sure what to do about it. You know, we were all asked sort of informally, would we take a test for unconscious bias? And some of us did it and some of us didn't, and it's quite shocking as an individual how you rate on some of these things. But even though you may show these things, what do you do about it? How do you even know that you're doing it? It's one of those very odd kinds of things, and that's why a group of very smart people are going to be taking a look at this. Social scientists have been very interested in this for other reasons, but here I sit at the Center for Scientific Review, which determines the future of all of these individuals, and we're not quite sure what to do about it, but please think about it, and seriously, let me and Wally know what your thoughts are, because we really do want to try to pursue some of these ideas.
And I do have a suggestion for you. I didn't see where you had the transgender category, and we want to be sure that we have enough transgenders represented as PIs as well, because those topics are important.
I agree. So it's all self-identification, as PIs and reviewers have an opportunity to identify what groups they, both in gender and in ethnicity and race. There's a large percentage that don't identify themselves as anything. They're the unknowns, actually, other. And so not everyone identifies, and then the ones that do, it's based on their own self-identification. And part of the study was also that there are groups who never identify themselves. And they tend to be more the underrepresented minorities who don't want to identify.
Great.
I'm happy to receive your letters. Send me email, I'm happy to look at it.
Carrie of a burning W at NIH.
I have one very quick question. Wally, do you have any sense if this is an NIH thing or if this is grants in general from all sources?
NSF has been publishing success rates by race and ethnicity for years and years, and they have the same problem that's just not as big as it is for NIH.
What about CDC?
Great. Well, can we have a round of applause for our outstanding panel? And thank you to all of you for coming. I think we had an outstanding audience here, much larger than last year. This is really great to see the interest in women's health. Just wanted to let everyone know we do have a program director from NINR, Dr. Xenia Tino. There's a slide that's coming up right now. You can switch to the next slide. Right. So Dr. Tino is a program director at the National Institute for Nursing Research. How many of you are nurses here? Great. Well, there will be a sign-up sheet for those of you who might be interested in speaking to her about opportunities at that institute. She will be at the ORWH booth. That will be open tomorrow. There will be a sign-up sheet. She's got her cell phone. She's really excited to talk with any of you who are interested in funding opportunities at that institute. And we also wanted to share with you the Office of Research in Women's Health has an exhibit table where Dr. Tina will be, and we have resources that we wanted to share with you, and some of them